There's a moment, you know it, when love becomes a kind of archaeology. You find yourself digging deeper into someone else's soul, convinced that if you just excavate enough, if you just tend their wounds with enough precision, they'll bloom into the person you see shimmering beneath their surface. This is where Marcus found himself at 32, kneeling in what he called Sarah's emotional garden, hands black with the soil of her past traumas. But Sarah's garden was no ordinary plot of earth. In this place that existed somewhere between dream and waking, between desire and destruction, the plants grew according to different laws. The roses she asked him to tend had thorns that curved inward, piercing not him but themselves. The fruit trees bore golden apples that, when bitten, revealed cores of ash. And at the center of it all stood Sarah herself, not as gardener, but as a statue made of the finest porcelain, beautiful and untouchable, directing his labor with eyes that never quite met his. The air hung thick with the scent of jasmine and decay, and Marcus moved between the rows like a devoted monk, pruning her anxieties, fertilizing her dreams with his own abandoned ambitions. Each morning, he would arrive before dawn, and she would appear at the garden's edge, wrapped in silk that shifted colors with her moods, now emerald with approval, now crimson with a disappointment she could never name. She would point to withered sections that needed his attention, whisper instructions about which memories required deeper cultivation, which fears needed more careful tending. What Marcus didn't see, what he couldn't see, lost as he was in the intoxicating mythology of being needed, was that beneath every plant he nourished, golden chains grew like root systems. Each act of devotion added another link. Each sacrifice of his own needs forged another binding. The garden was not growing upward toward the light as he believed, but downward into an elaborate prison he was building with his own hands. The other men who had worked this garden before him lay buried beneath the roses, their bones serving as fertilizer, their dreams composting into the rich soil that made Sarah's beauty possible. And still she stood, porcelain and perfect, directing the dance of devotion that would eventually consume him too. For as Schopenhauer understood, what we call love is often the will's cruelest joke, a force that convinces us we are caring for another while we methodically destroy ourselves. The terrible revelation came not in a moment of anger or betrayal, but in a quiet instant of perfect clarity. Marcus looked up from his work to find Sarah watching him with eyes that held no recognition, no gratitude, no love, only the cool appraisal of someone observing a particularly useful tool. In that gaze, he saw himself as she saw him, not a man, but a function, not a lover, but a gardener whose purpose was to maintain the elaborate stage set of her emotional life, while she remained forever the untouchable star of her own drama. The ancients called it enchantment. Today, psychology names it codependency. This psychological concept, first articulated by addiction specialists studying families of alcoholics, describes a pattern where one person becomes compulsively focused on managing another's emotional state, needs, and problems. It manifests in modern relationships as the partner who consistently sacrifices their own goals to save their lover, the parent who enables their adult child's destructive behavior while calling it love, the friend who becomes addicted to being needed. In workplace culture, we see it in the employee who takes on everyone else's responsibilities, believing their worth depends on being indispensable. Schopenhauer would recognize this as a particularly sophisticated trick of the will, that blind driving force he saw as the source of all suffering. The will doesn't simply want, it wants to want. It feeds on the perpetual dissatisfaction of caring for someone who can never truly be saved because their very unsavability is what makes the dynamic possible. The codependent person suffers not despite their devotion, but because of it, trapped in a cycle that promises fulfillment while delivering only deeper entanglement. In myth, it was the curse of Sisyphus. In you, it's the exhaustion you call love. Codependency. What does your garden look like? What have you planted there with your own forgotten dreams? The most devastating truth about golden cages is not that others build them for us, but that we become expert craftsmen of our own captivity, calling it devotion, calling it love, calling it anything but what it truly is: the systematic burial of ourselves beneath someone else's needs. The devotee tends the garden until he becomes the fertilizer. He polishes her reflection until his own face disappears. You've done this, stood in front of someone, and slowly, methodically edited yourself out of existence. Started with small things, laughing at jokes that weren't funny, nodding at opinions that made your skin crawl, swallowing words that might disturb the peace. David discovered that love, for him, was a kind of elaborate disappearing act, performed nightly in the theater of Elena's expectations. In the realm where desires take physical form, David worked as a mirror maker, but not the kind you might imagine. His mirrors didn't reflect what was, they reflected what Elena needed to see. In his workshop, a place that smelled of silver dust and regret, he spent his days crafting looking glasses that showed Elena as she wished to be, more beautiful, more interesting, more worthy of the love she could never quite believe she deserved. The walls were lined with hundreds of these flattering mirrors, each one a different lie he'd learned to tell with his hands. Elena would visit his workshop each evening, moving from mirror to mirror, like a queen inspecting her domain. In the first, she saw herself as the intellectual she'd always wanted to be, spouting the philosophy David had carefully fed her from books she'd never read. In the second, she appeared as the artist she'd abandoned being, surrounded by paintings David had secretly commissioned and hung in their apartment, claiming she'd created them in forgotten moments of inspiration. In the third, she was the wounded bird she'd convinced herself she was, delicate and in need of constant protection from a world too harsh for her sensitivity. But here was the terrible alchemy of David's devotion. Each mirror that showed Elena more clearly seemed to make him less visible. As he perfected the art of reflection, his own image began to fade. First, his opinions became echoes of hers. Then his interests withered, replaced by an encyclopedic knowledge of her preferences. His own dreams, once vivid and demanding, became translucent, then invisible entirely. The workshop's walls, which had once been covered with mirrors, now held only empty frames, each one marking another piece of himself he'd sacrificed to maintain her illusions. The other mirror makers who had worked for women like Elena lay scattered around the workshop floor, not dead, but worse, completely transparent, their substance worn away by years of reflection and accommodation. They moved through the space like ghosts, still polishing mirrors for lovers who could no longer see them, trapped in a labor they no longer remembered choosing. Elena, meanwhile, grew more solid with each passing day, more real, more certain of herself. She had become a queen of reflected light, sustained entirely by the devotion of someone who had forgotten how to cast a shadow. And David, lost in the hypnotic rhythm of his work, began to believe that this was what love looked like, the systematic erasure of self in service to another's need to feel substantial. The revelation came when David finally looked into one of his own mirrors and saw nothing looking back. not because the mirror was broken, but because there was no longer enough of him left to reflect. In that moment of absolute transparency, he understood what Schopenhauer knew about desire, that it doesn't seek to possess the beloved, but to be possessed by them, to dissolve entirely into their reality until nothing remains but the act of loving itself. The ancient Greeks called it metamorphosis. Today, psychology names it projection. This mechanism, first described by Freud and later expanded by Jung, occurs when we unconsciously attribute our own thoughts, feelings, or characteristics to another person. In modern relationships, it manifests as the partner who constantly needs to save others from problems they themselves refuse to face, the parent who lives vicariously through their child's achievements to avoid confronting their own unfulfilled dreams, the friend who sees their own worst qualities in everyone around them while maintaining an idealized self-image. In workplace dynamics, we see it in managers who blame their teams for the chaos they themselves create. Schopenhauer would recognize projection as the will's most sophisticated defense mechanism, a way of avoiding the painful recognition of our own nature by casting it onto others like shadows on a wall. The projector suffers not from loving too little, but from loving in a way that requires the complete annihilation of self-knowledge. They become mirrors that show others what they want to see while reflecting nothing of their own truth. In fairy tales, it was the magic mirror. In you, it's the exhaustion you call empathy, projection. How many mirrors have you polished today? What do you refuse to see in your own reflection that you work so desperately to perfect in others? The cruelest irony of projection is that in our attempt to love others completely, we make ourselves invisible and discover that what we thought was selfless devotion was actually the most selfish act of all, the refusal to exist as we truly are. A discarded silver-framed mirror lies cracked in the corner, reflecting nothing but empty space. She builds cathedrals of crisis where he can worship at the altar of being essential. There's an art to breaking beautifully, and Maria had mastered it. Watch her hands, how they tremble just so when she needs rescue, how her voice cracks at precisely the right moment to suggest fragility that requires immediate attention. This is manipulation, elevated to high theater, so exquisite that even she doesn't recognize it as performance. In the city of perpetual twilight, where emotional architectures take physical form, Maria worked as a crisis architect. Her specialty was designing elaborate emergencies that required exactly one solution: James's immediate and total devotion. Her latest masterpiece was a cathedral of catastrophe that spanned 7 city blocks, its spires piercing the low-hanging clouds like desperate prayers. Each wing of this magnificent structure housed a different variety of urgent need: the chapel of financial ruin, the sanctuary of health scares, the nave of family drama, all of them requiring James's skilled hands to prevent their collapse. The cathedral's construction was a marvel of emotional engineering. Maria had learned to time her crises with the precision of a Swiss watchmaker. Just when James began to develop interests outside their relationship, a new wing would suddenly require urgent renovation. When he mentioned old friends or past dreams, the foundation would develop alarming cracks that demanded immediate attention. The building never actually fell. That would end the game, but it perpetually trembled on the edge of disaster, requiring James's constant vigilance to maintain its precarious stability. James had become the cathedral's sole caretaker, its high priest of prevention. He moved through its corridor like a man possessed, checking for structural weaknesses, reinforcing emotional buttresses, polishing the stained glass windows, that depicted Maria's various sufferings in brilliant, heartbreaking detail. The altar, at the center of it all, was dedicated not to any god, but to his own indispensability. Here, he would kneel each morning and evening, offering prayers of sacrifice, his sleep for her insomnia, his opportunities for her emergencies, his peace for her storms. What James couldn't see, lost as he was in the intoxicating importance of being needed, was that the cathedral was built on quicksand. The very foundation of their relationship was designed to be unstable, because stability would make his services unnecessary. Maria, meanwhile, had learned to inhabit the building like a queen in her castle, moving from crisis to crisis with the practiced grace of someone who had discovered that suffering, when properly performed, was the most reliable currency for purchasing devotion. The other architects who had worked for women like Maria could be found in the cathedral's basement, men who had exhausted themselves maintaining impossible structures until they simply collapsed into the foundation, becoming part of the very edifice they died trying to support. Their bones served as pillars now, their abandoned dreams as mortar, holding up monuments to the terrible beauty of orchestrated need. The awakening came not when the cathedral finally fell, but when James realized it was designed never to fall, only to consume. Standing in the central nave at 3 a.m, reinforcing a crisis that felt exactly like the crisis from 3 months ago, he understood what Schopenhauer meant about the will's hunger. It doesn't want to be satisfied because satisfaction would end the game. The crisis wasn't the problem to be solved. It was the solution to the problem of how to keep someone devoted forever. The Romans called it bread and circuses. Today, psychology names it learned helplessness. This concept, discovered by psychologist Martin Seligman through his experiments with dogs who stop at trying to escape electric shocks, describes how repeated exposure to uncontrollable situations can condition someone to stop trying to change their circumstances, even when change becomes possible. In modern relationships, it manifests as the partner who creates constant emergencies that only they can fix, the parent who deliberately undermines their child's independence to maintain control, the boss who manufactures chaos to appear indispensable. In social media culture, we see it in the friend who posts endless crises that require immediate emotional labor from their network. Schopenhauer would recognize learned helplessness as the will's most patient strategy, teaching us that our efforts are futile while simultaneously making us addicted to the very act of trying. The helper suffers not from lacking problems to solve, but from solving problems that are designed to be unsolvable, trapped in a cycle that promises resolution while delivering only deeper entanglement in another person's carefully constructed dependency. In mythology, it was Sisyphus and his boulder. In you, it's the exhaustion you call responsibility, learned helplessness. What cathedral are you building? What crises do you manufacture to ensure someone remains essential to your survival? The most sophisticated manipulation is the kind that convinces both participants they are victims of circumstances beyond their control, when in truth, one has become the architect of the very chaos the other has learned to worship as inevitable. A moth flutters desperately inside a jar, its wings casting shadows on the cathedral walls. He learns to find peace only in the eye of her hurricane. The silence terrifies him now. After 3 years of living inside Rebecca's emotional weather system, calm feels like abandonment, and he's forgotten how to exist without the electricity of crisis running through his veins. In the realm where emotional climates manifest as literal weather, Daniel had become the keeper of Rebecca's personal hurricane, a storm system so vast and complexity. It had its own geography, its own seasons, its own terrible beauty. This wasn't the simple rain and wind of ordinary human emotion, but something far more sophisticated, a meteorological masterpiece of manufactured chaos that had been refined over years of careful cultivation. At the storm's eye, where the winds stopped and an eerie stillness reigned, Daniel had built his home, a small, precise structure designed to exist nowhere but in the center of catastrophe. The hurricane had different zones, each requiring Daniel's specialized knowledge to navigate. The outer bands were where Rebecca's minor dissatisfactions swirled, complaints about work, irritations with friends, general malaise about the state of the world. Here, Daniel had learned to move with practiced efficiency, providing exactly the right amount of attention to prevent these minor disturbances from spiraling into the more dangerous inner storms. The eye wall was where her major emotions raged: fury at perceived slights, devastation over imagined betrayals, despair so profound it seemed to bend reality itself. This was the most dangerous region, where Daniel's smallest miscalculation could unleash winds strong enough to destroy everything they'd built together. But it was in the eye, that perfect circle of artificial calm at the hurricane's center, where Daniel had learned to find his peculiar form of peace. Here, in the shadow of towering walls of wind and rain, he experienced something he'd mistaken for love, the intoxicating relief of temporary safety purchased through perfect vigilance. The eye existed only because of the storm surrounding it, and Daniel existed only because he had mastered the art of keeping the hurricane's violence precisely calibrated. Dangerous enough to make the center feel like sanctuary, controlled enough to prevent total destruction. Rebecca moved through her weather system like a storm goddess, beautiful and terrible, her moods shifting the very air pressure around them. She had long ago lost the ability to distinguish between authentic emotion and the performance of emotion, between genuine crisis and the elaborate theater of need she'd constructed to ensure Daniel's constant attention. The hurricane was no longer something she experienced. It was something she was, something she'd become so completely that calm weather felt like death. What Daniel couldn't see, intoxicated as he was by his role as stormkeeper, was that he'd forgotten how to exist in sunshine. The other keepers who had tried to manage similar hurricanes lay scattered across the storm's path, some torn apart by winds they couldn't predict, others simply dissolved by the constant pressure of maintaining impossible vigilance. They had all made the same mistake, believing that love meant learning to find peace in chaos, rather than finding someone capable of creating peace itself. The awakening came not in a moment of destruction, but in a rare instance when the hurricane simply stopped. For 6 hours, the world was still, and in that stillness, Daniel discovered something that terrified him more than any storm. He no longer knew who he was without crisis to manage, without emergency to avert, without someone else's emotional weather to predict and control. He had become addicted not to Rebecca, but to the adrenaline of keeping her stable, an addiction that required her instability to sustain itself. In that moment of terrible clarity, he understood what Schopenhauer meant about suffering as the natural state of human existence. We don't seek happiness, we seek the temporary relief from suffering that we mistake for happiness. And Daniel had found his relief in the eye of someone else's storm, never recognizing that the storm existed primarily to create the relief. The ancient Stoics called it ataraxia, freedom from emotional disturbance. Today, psychology names it trauma bonding. This phenomenon, first studied in hostage situations and abusive relationships, occurs when intense shared experiences, particularly those involving cycles of tension and relief, create powerful emotional bonds that feel like love, but are actually addictive patterns of stress and release. It manifests in modern relationships as couples who can only feel close during crises, individuals who interpret drama as passion, people who unconsciously sabotage periods of stability because they feel more real during conflict. In workplace culture, we see it in teams that bond over shared suffering under toxic management, mistaking collective trauma for authentic connection. Schopenhauer would recognize trauma bonding as the will's cruelest joke, training us to seek relief in the very situations that create our suffering, making us addicted to the disease while calling it the cure. The trauma-bonded person suffers not from too little love, but from love that has been confused with survival, attachment that requires crisis to feel authentic. In literature, it was Beauty and the Beast. In you, it's the chaos you call passion, trauma bonding. When was the last time you felt truly peaceful? Not the artificial calm of crisis management, but the deep quiet of genuine safety. The most insidious aspect of trauma bonding is how it teaches us to interpret calm as abandonment and chaos as care, until we can no longer recognize love that doesn't require us to be rescuers or victims. A clock with no hands sits abandoned on a windowsill, marking time that no longer matters. She maps territories that exist only when he's lost, trying to reach them. The most beautiful countries are the ones that vanish the moment you arrive, leaving only the memory of having glimpsed something perfect from a distance. Michael had become an expert cartographer of impossible love, spending 7 years mapping the geography of Lisa's affection, a country that existed in perpetual recession, always just beyond his reach, always promising to reveal itself fully if he could just find the right route, the correct approach, the perfect combination of devotion and distance. You know this territory. You've spent nights studying its borders, trying to decode the logic of a place that seems designed specifically to be almost attainable. In the realm where desires take the form of landscapes, Lisa's love manifested as a magnificent city built on a floating island that moved according to no earthly laws. From his camp on the mainland, Michael could see it clearly. Its golden spires catching the light, its gardens where every flower bloomed in impossible colors, its inhabitants, versions of Lisa, moving through streets that seemed to pulse with the very essence of fulfillment. The city was close enough that he could make out individual buildings, could almost hear the laughter floating across the water, but far enough that no bridge could reach it, no boat could cross the space between shore and shore. Michael's camp had grown over the years into a complex settlement of longing. His tent was surrounded by telescopes, trained on the floating city, maps covering every surface, notebooks filled with observations about the island's movements and moods. He had cataloged the way it drifted closer during Lisa's vulnerable moments, how it receded when he showed too much confidence, the way it shimmered more brightly when he threatened to give up entirely. The camp was populated by other cartographers who had attempted similar expeditions, men and women whose love had become an academic discipline, a science of perpetual approach that never quite reached its destination. The island operated on a principle that Michael had never consciously recognized, but had lived by for years. It could only exist as long as it remained unreachable. The moment he stopped pursuing it, the city would begin to fade. But if he pursued it too directly, it would retreat beyond the horizon entirely. The only way to maintain its existence was through a precise calibration of desire and despair, hope and hopelessness, that kept both the island and his devotion locked in perpetual motion without ever achieving resolution. Lisa, meanwhile, had long ago forgotten that the floating city was supposed to be her gift to him. She had become so identified with being unreachable that reachability felt like death. She existed now primarily as the architect of distance, unconsciously adjusting the island's position to maintain the perfect space between connection and separation. She was no longer someone who might love him. She was someone whose function was to be almost willing to love him forever. The terrible beauty of this arrangement was its sustainability. Unlike the storms and crises of other fables, the floating city could maintain itself indefinitely, feeding on the very longing it created. Michael aged in his camp, his hair growing gray as he refined his maps, his expertise in impossible love becoming the only skill he possessed. He had become a monk of maybe, a priest of almost, devoted to a deity that existed only as long as it remained divine, which is to say, untouchable. The revelation came not when the island finally docked, but when Michael realized it was designed never to dock, that his 7 years of cartography had been mapping not a destination, but a mirage, not Lisa's love, but his own addiction to the feeling of being on the verge of being loved. The island wasn't moving away from him. He was moving around it in careful circles, mistaking orbit for approach. In that moment of crystalline understanding, he grasped what Schopenhauer knew about the nature of desire itself. We don't want what we want to want. The actual possession of the beloved would end the exquisite torture that gives life its meaning. The floating city existed not to be reached, but to be pursued, and Michael had spent 7 years perfecting the art of pursuit while calling it love. The troubadours called it courtly love. Today, psychology names it fantasy bonding. This concept, developed by psychologist Robert Firestone, describes the formation of emotional connections to imagined versions of people rather than their actual selves. It manifests in modern dating culture as relationships with potential rather than reality, the person who falls in love with who someone could become rather than who they are, the individual who maintains passionate connections to unavailable people while feeling bored by those who offer genuine intimacy. In digital culture, we see it in parasocial relationships with influencers and celebrities who exist primarily as curated fantasies. Schopenhauer would recognize fantasy bonding as the will's most elegant trap, teaching us to prefer the idea of satisfaction to satisfaction itself, because ideas can be perfected in ways that reality never can. The fantasy-bonded person suffers not from lacking love, but from loving in a way that requires the beloved to remain fundamentally unavailable, trapped in devotion to what might be rather than what is. In romance novels, it was the distant prince. In you, it's the obsession you call hope, fantasy bonding. What floating cities do you see from your shore? What love exists only as long as it remains just beyond your reach? The most sophisticated prison is the one that convinces us we are explorers while we walk in careful circles, mapping territories that exist only to be mapped, loving people who exist only to be almost loved. The final whisper comes not from the island, but from the space between island and shore, that gap where all impossible loves live and breathe and die without ever being born. Some distances are not meant to be crossed, but to be treasured, because the most beautiful love stories are the ones that end before they begin. A rope bridge stretches into fog so thick that its destination cannot be seen, if it has a destination at all.